Hello, I'm Pat Miller McFall. Welcome to our lecture on Revolutionary War Era Genealogy Part 2, titled Records Created After the Revolutionary War, presented by Craig R. Scott. He's the author of Lost Pensions, Settled Accounts of Act of 6 April 1838, revised, and Records of the Counting Officers of the Department of the Treasury Inventory 14 revised. His most recent work is Understanding Revolutionary War and Invalid Pension Ledgers 1818-1872 and the payment vouchers they represent. He has authored 17 books and several articles in the National Genealogical Society Quarterly, the Magazine of Virginia Genealogy, and other genealogical publications. He has coordinated many Heritage Book genealogical conferences and cruises. He is recipient of the Graham T. Smallwood Jr. Award, and he became a fellow in Utah Genealogical Association in 2014. Without further ado, welcome back, Craig. Good to see you.
Thank you. So today we're going to talk about records created after the Revolutionary War. It's important that you understand certain things about the war, the organizations, and then the records. And we talked about the records that were created during the war before. Today we're going to talk about the records created after the war. We need to have a research strategy, so keep this in mind while I'm talking. Pensions are probably the most important records that were created after the war. I know my experience, my first experience with pension records was when I was 16 years old. And I was looking in the microfilm for my William E. Brockett, who was a major in the South Carolina line during the Revolution. And I found this Bible record in his pension on the microfilm. And the first question I had is, how is it possible to have a reverse photostat in a pension from 1832? But that's a different issue. It turns out that the government sent Bible records back to people in the 1880s and put a reverse photostat in the pensions. And that's how that ended up there. And you can see by looking at this that it's really difficult to read. So I showed it to an archives technician and I said, I just can't read this. And he took pity on me and he sent me to another room and they brought me the original pension. And I was 16 and I was hooked. From that moment on, I knew I was going to be a genealogist. And this record right here, out of this Revolutionary War pension, is one of the records that made that possible. I didn't tell the person, because I didn't know at the time, that there was a letter in the pension that described all the information that was in that Bible record, because I just got up and left. I went back to it later, but there was that letter. Most people, when they do pension research, they find the right index, they order the pension, or today they go out on fold 3, they pray they got the whole pension, they read the pension, and they stop. Well, that's not how I want you to do it. I want you to look at it in an entirely different way. There's such a thing as pension law. No one can get a pension unless there is a law that says that they qualify for that pension. You're probably familiar with pension application files, but there are also pension office ledgers, pension vouchers, last payments, final payments, other settled accounts, and pension office correspondence. All of those kinds of things should be dealt with because most of the answers that you can't find in a pension application file might be found in a last payment, final payment, or a pension voucher, or even pension office correspondence, or other settled accounts. Now, there are several kinds of pensions. There are state pensions, there are federal pensions. The best place to look for state pensions is Lloyd Boxstruck's book on Revolutionary War pensions. These are all the state awards. Now, some states have separate books, like Virginia, for example, but this book is probably a single one-stop shopping place to go for the state pensions, but we're really not going to talk about those. The federal government in 1792, 1793 took over responsibility for that, and they created federal law that allowed pensions beginning in 1776, there are pensions for invalids, but the longevity pensions start in 1818. And then in 1832, there are other pensions. I'll go through some of those for you, but every time you see the words act of, you're going to want to go look at statutes at large to see what it is. What did it mean? And you can do that by going out to the Library of Congress website and typing in statutes at large. Christine Rose has created a book on military pension acts from 1776 to 1858, and it provides information about each one of the pension laws that relate to Revolutionary War service. Other than the invalid pensions that existed before 1818, the first Pension Act for living long enough and serving in the right way, meaning serving in the Continental Line, begins in 1818. Now, this law required that you have service, and that it also required that you were indigent, but most people didn't pay attention to the indigent part, indigent meaning being poor, and almost everybody applied for a pension that qualified. And the government didn't have enough money to pay all these pensions because they were still paying for the War of 1812. So in 1820, they came out and said, well, you got to prove you're indigent. And they gave the Secretary of War the power to actually determine whether you were indigent or not. And that was totally under his purview. There was no criteria established to say what was indigent, just that the Secretary of War would determine. So you'll see many times the words struck off the roll. There's a book for Kentucky that talks about Revolutionary War pensioners struck off the roll. Well, these are individuals who were too rich to continue to get a pension. Well, I don't know about you, but if my congressman all of a sudden voted to take away my pension, I wouldn't be voting for him the next time around. And that happened. Our ancestors aren't much different than we are. So by 1828, all of that was restored. So no longer was being indigent part of pensions until we get to the Confederacy. But from then on, from 1828 on, federal pensions no longer dealt with the concept of being indigent. By 1832, the militiamen were saying, hey, what about us? And they've been saying that for a long time. And by 1832, the government figured most of them were dead, so it would be okay to give those that were remaining pensions. They were surprised that there were many more militiamen out there than they thought. In 1836, there began the process of offering widows' pensions. Those in 1836 were widows married before the end of the term of the enlistment of the soldier. Through various acts up to 1855, the marriage date changed. And then by 1855, the marriage date was removed. So that meant by 1855, there were a lot of widows who were much younger than the soldiers. This is a letter that you may find in a pension that deals with an individual who is found under the Act of 1820 to be poor enough to continue his pension. So you'll know that if you see this kind of letter in the pension, that in fact there was an evaluation done and the Secretary of War determined that the individual would continue to have the pension. You'll find in court records in 1820, 1821, in local courthouses and county courthouses, that people are coming in and providing inventories, what they own, so that so the clerk of court can provide a endorsement for them to be able to continue to get their pension. So you want to look in county records where the person was living in 1820, 1821 timeframe to see if those kinds of inventories do exist. You should be familiar with pension application files because most of you have probably used them in order to get into the DAR to begin with. They're all out on Fold 3, at least all those under the normal laws of such as 1818, 1832, 1836, those kind of things. They're all out on Fold 3. In other words, what was on the microfilm is out there on Fold 3. There is an index to Revolutionary War pension applications that I use all the time. It's called Hoyt's. And the reason I use it is because it gives me the pension number. I can know in a glance what kind of pension I may be dealing with. An S doesn't stand for soldier, it stands for survivor. A W stands for widow, and an R stands for rejected. The BLWT stands for bounty land warrant, and this deals with a register of bounty land warrants that survived one of the two fires in DC in the early 1800s. In a pension file, you may find more than one file, especially if it's a W or an R file. An S file may have two pension files in it. It may have the soldier being rejected and then the soldier being accepted. You may find a soldier pension, a survivor pension, in with a widow's pension. So it's very important that when you look at these pensions, that you separate them out and put them in different piles as to who belongs to what, so that you have the survivor pension in one pile, the widow pension in another pile, and then you make them chronological, and then you'll be able to deal with them much better. There are also Virgil White. This is how we did it old school. There were genealogical abstracts of Revolutionary War pension files. Unfortunately, he doesn't tell us about the service of the soldier, except that maybe he was a militiaman or in the state line unit. He went and looked in the selected records. There are two sets of microfilm. One is selected, one is the full set. He only pulled information out from the selected set. So recognize that if you do use those, this is a good way to determine whether there's a pension to begin with if you don't have access to Fold 3. I highly recommend, if you're doing Revolutionary War research, that you use Fold 3, because probably 95% of all the material that the federal government has that relates to the Revolutionary War is in fact on Fold 3. All that's missing are some payment vouchers and some last and final payments that we'll talk about in a bit. So there is this Revolutionary War collection out on Fold 3 that deals with pensions, service records, Revolutionary War rolls, some payment vouchers, and some other miscellaneous material. And basically, you just type in the guy's name, select Revolutionary War. This is Enoch Furr, and you'll find that there may be a payment voucher, an index to a final payment voucher out there. There may be a Revolutionary War pension. You want to look at both of them. They're out there. The pensions are by state of service, not state where they were residing at the time they applied for their pension. The index to final pension payments, last and final payments, is by the state in which they were living. So you want to keep these two things separate in your head. The pensions are filed by where the state of service was from. And they're by first letter of surname, and then they are by surname. You have someone with a pension, the pension is going to lead you to their service, but you may find that they in fact do not have a compiled military service record, just because Enoch Furr is an individual who doesn't have a compiled military service record, but he does have a pension. When you look at Virgil White, you'll see that he tells us about Enoch. He says that who his lawyer was, Asa Rogers. He talks about his widow. We know that Enoch is probably a militiaman because it's the Act of 1832, and we know what pension agency he's with. He's with the Richmond, Virginia Pension Agency. Although later on in his life, he determines it's easier to go to DC than it is to go to Richmond to get his pension. The difference between 110 miles and 55 miles. There is another pension office in Virginia in this time period, and that's located in Wheeling. Remember that Wheeling is in Virginia, not in West Virginia in 1832. It doesn't become West Virginia until 1863. So this is what the pension envelope looks like. We see in the upper left-hand corner that he's serving from Virginia. We see that his wife is Sarah. This means that if the wife's name is there, she applied for a pension. It doesn't mean she got one, but that she applied. When you look on the right-hand side and you see that W, you know that she applied and that she got a pension. This does not tell you that Enoch applied and got a pension. It isn't until we get into the pension itself that we see the actual pension trifold, and this one is for Enoch Furr. So we now know that Enoch got a pension. And this is the same thing, only this is for Sarah. So we know that Sarah got a pension also. So here we have two pensions. in the same file. You want to take each one of the pieces of paper that you find in the file and transcribe it. There may be words you don't understand. If you read them, and your eyes will go right over them. Transcribe what you read and you will learn a lot more from the pension. This is people talking about the marriage of Sarah and Enoch. People who weren't present at the marriage, but people who were in the neighborhood. And there may be one or two of those, because a widow has to prove the service of the soldier and has to prove her marriage to the soldier. One of the first things that I look for are typed letters that are in the file. Now, there are two kinds of typed letters in the file. There are those from an individual to the pension office and those from the pension office to an individual. I take those that are from the pension office, such as this one. They will abstract the information out of the pension, and it is a good roadmap to figure out what's going on inside the pension. What you want to do with these letters is find the place in the pension where they found the information to put in the letter. These can go on for a couple of pages. It may mention people who have the same surname but doesn't provide a relationship. These are all clues to which direction you want to go. There also is, in many of the pensions, a summary of the pension. This is basically the first look at what they were putting into the letters. And this tells us who Sarah is, that her maiden name is Clausen, that Enoch was at the Battle of Great Bridge, who he served with, those kinds of things. So you again want to find where this information is also located in the pension. Another roadmap. So we now have two roadmaps. You'll also may find in the pension this form letter that says, "Sir, under the Act of 6 April 1838. I'm not going to talk about it right now, but you want to, if you see this in the pension, you know that there are other records that you're going to want to look at. The finding aid to those is the lost pensions, settled accounts of 6 April 1838. Now, here's a letter written to the Commissioner of Pensions, and it says that Enoch Furr was a Revolutionary War soldier. Well, he got a pension, so we know that came over from France with Lafayette and fought through the Revolutionary War. Well, in Enoch's pension, it says that he was born in Fauquier County, Virginia, and at the age of 6 moved to Loudoun County, Virginia. So it's unlikely that he went to France and then came with Lafayette. In fact, the only person to come with Lafayette the first time around was the Baron de Kalb. But that's a much different story. So again, take with a grain of salt those things that are found in letters that are written to the Commissioner of Pensions. Believe what the Commissioner of Pensions writes back. Most people are going to stop right there. They're not going to do anything more. And this is what I want to try to change in your research methodology. We're going to talk about pension office ledgers, the vouchers that are represented by those ledgers, and then special kinds of vouchers, meaning last and final payments, and then other settled accounts like the Act of 6 April 1838. The place where these records are located is the National Archives. There's a finding aid to the records of the Accounting Officer's Department of Treasury, Inventory 14, revised, that contains the series entry level information for these records when you want to do the source citation for them, or you want to try to locate them. If you have problems following with me tonight or today in regards to what we're about to talk to, this book on Understanding Revolutionary War and Invalid Pension Ledgers will be very helpful to you in your search. There is an article out in Prologue Magazine that is online by Claire Prechtel-Clustons on Follow the Money, Tracking Revolutionary War Pension Payments. I'd advise that you take a look at this. It's a very good orienting piece to get you in the right frame of mind to do the research. So let's talk about pension ledgers first. They actually are on a couple of rolls of microfilm, actually more than one roll, but there's two sets. One is those that cover 1801 to 1815. These are didn't used to be on Ancestry, and now they are, and they are combined with the second set of pension payments. These are invalid pension payments prior to September of 1815. They are basically in two sets, 1801 to 1809 and 1809 to 1815. They're arranged by state and territory, so it may be better to go and browse so you don't have to rely on Ancestry's indexing to see them, but each state has certain pages, and the finding aid to these will in fact identify that for you. And this is the second set. So if you go to the card catalog on Ancestry, I always type in the nuance for me. The tip is type in 1818 to 1872, and it pops up right up by itself. So you can see here, U.S. Revolutionary War pensioners, 1801 to 1815, and that's the records we just talked about. And then the second part of it is 1818 to 1872. So this is what it looks like. Basically, it's just when payments were made. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this set, but I am going to do a deep dive into the second set, which is T718, Ledgers of Payments, U.S. pensioners under the Acts of 1818 through 1858 for records in the Office of the Third Auditor of the Treasury. So these are those that are covered under the Act of 1818, the Continental Line Act, under the Act of 1832, the Militia Act, under the various other pensions in between, then the widows' pensions beginning in 1836. The other nuance that's here in this time frame is these ledgers also cover War of 1812 invalid pensions. You can get a good browse at what's among these ledgers in the Military Service Records catalog. If you happen to own a copy of it, you can download this select microfilm catalog from archives.gov. And basically, it will give you information about what is in this 1818 to 1872 set of pension ledgers. It will tell you the microfilm rolls that it originally was on before Ancestry put it up. In the old days, we used to have to do this by hand. It was just terrible. It's a lot easier to do now. But you can see that it's invalid pensioners. These invalid pensioners, because of the time frame, more than likely are War of 1812, but then they're Revolutionary War pensioners, and then widow pensions also. So if when we look at these pension payment volumes, these ledgers, for many of them, they may show a date of death. And all that it will do is it'll show when payments are made, and then it may show a date of death. It may show when somebody transferred to a different pension agency. Basically, we'll get the name of the pensioner, maybe the name of the widow and the name of the pensioner, the act of Congress under which the payment was made, and the pension agency who's making the payment. So these ledgers are by pension agency. So if we look at, we can follow it by looking at the years that are actually being covered. So the first ledgers cover 1818 to 1832. Then in 1820, there's another set of ledgers for those Revolutionary War pensioners who continue on, who are added after 1818, who are determined to be indigent and able. And then we see that the pension ledgers then begin in 1833. The Act of 1832 for the militiamen doesn't occur until 1833, and they're paid retroactively back to 1832. So that's why it says 33. Invalid pensions, and then various other acts. So basically, these are all rolls of microfilm that translate into places in Ancestry where these things can be found. having this roadmap will help you in Ancestry, knowing that you're in the right place. Each one of these is by state. So within the roll, there are states. So here we see Connecticut. It doesn't tell, this is the pension agency of Connecticut. It doesn't tell us at this point where the actual pension agency office is. Pension agency offices tended to be in banks because banks had vaults. In this time period, there are no real federal buildings outside of Washington, D.C. They don't do it in post offices. They don't do it in grocery stores. They do it in banks because banks have vaults. Most pension agents are in fact bankers. Occasionally there's a political appointment, but they found that didn't work out very well. And for the most part, pension agents are bankers. So you see here on Ancestry, you can see down here the list, US pensioners 1818 to 1872. These are actually the pension ledgers. It looks like the search screen looks like this. You can either do it by name or you can browse a location. You start with a state and then a year. So I like to browse personally because I don't trust Ancestry indexing. It's just me. So we can look at Ohio, for example, but there comes a point where we also see that in Ohio, there are pension offices that are created. So in Ohio, there is not only the Ohio office, which is likely Columbus, or Cincinnati rather, but there is Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Columbus. They basically established pension offices wherever they had Revolutionary War pensioners in numbers. And as the numbers decreased, the offices would disappear. Let's talk about a soldier. This is Daniel Waldo. He doesn't die until 1864, so he's one of the last Revolutionary War soldiers around. If you've never seen a photograph of a Revolutionary War soldier, here's one. There are other photographs of him in Maureen Taylor's books, 2-volume set of The Last Muster, which is photographs of Revolutionary War soldiers. If you've never seen that series, I highly recommend it. But anyway, Daniel is originally from Connecticut. He was photographed by Hilliard near the end of the war, and he's in the book Last Men of the Revolution, and that's where his picture came from. He's born in Windham, Connecticut. He gets drafted at 16 for a month of service. He later enlists some more, and eventually he ends up as prisoner in the Sugar House in New York. By the time it's all said and done, he becomes a congregational minister. He marries and has several children, and he eventually will move to Albany. And that's pretty much all that anybody knows about Daniel before you start looking at his pension ledger. Here is his compiled military service record. He's with Levi Wells Regiment in Connecticut. He doesn't serve very long, but he's there. Here's his pension envelope. And here is the pension ledger. So here's Connecticut. Notice it starts in 1831. Payments were made on the 4th of March and the 4th of September of each year. And the purpose of the ledger was to provide an annotation to say when the individual was actually paid. So you'll see the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then above some numbers you'll see other numbers like 35 or 36, for example. This says what quarter the individual was paid in. So March is in the first quarter. So normally somebody would be paid in the first quarter. And then the third quarter is September. So where we see these 4s, this individual picked up their money in the fourth quarter. In other words, they picked it up in October, November or December of that year. So here's Daniel Waldo. And here he is in 1849 in the first quarter in March. He's getting a payment. In the third quarter, he's getting a payment, just like he should. In 1850, he's getting a payment in the first quarter, but then he's a little late. In 1850, he doesn't pick up his money until the second quarter. But by 1851, he's back on track. Each one of these numbers represents a payment voucher. And then we see that after the after the third quarter of 1851, he transfers to Albany, New York. So he leaves the Connecticut Pension Agency and he moves to Albany. Well, when we look at Albany, we can see that there is New York and there is Albany. So we may have to look in one of the other places, but it looks like we're going to find what we're looking for in Albany. It could, the other possibilities other than Albany are Brooklyn and Buffalo, although Brooklyn's not until 1853, 1858 rather, and Buffalo, although is available in 1818. So, but we know he goes to Albany, and here he is, about 5 names down the list, Daniel Waldo, and this is what is actually on the left-hand side of this ledger. And this is his application for transfer. He took this piece of paper from Connecticut with him to New York, and this is how he presented himself to the pension office in Albany so he could continue to get his pension. And here he is in Albany, and all of a sudden we see that he's being transferred to Columbia. Well, it turns out that by Columbia, they mean District of Columbia, that for a couple of years, Daniel Waldo is the chaplain of the House of Representatives. So we see him in the District of Columbia, in the ledger there for the District of Columbia. And then after a couple of years, we see he goes back to Albany. Now, we wouldn't know this if we hadn't have looked in the pension ledger, because for all intents and purposes, for all we know, he stayed in Albany the entire time. So we can use this material to behave like a census. So whereas with a census, we'd only know every 10 years where somebody moved to. This way, we can see them switch pension offices every 6 months. So we'll know within 6 months of when somebody moves somewhere. And then here we see him dying in June of 1854 in the Albany pension ledger. So we have a date of death. Now, the date of death doesn't help us from the perspective of where did they learn of this date of death. So we'll have to do some more research to do that. And here we see some other people where they're dying, where they're transferring, those kind of things. The last entry should be the last payment of record, and often the last entry will have a date of death. If there is the last entry and there is a date of death, it's likely that you're going to be able to find heirs. So what we have here is the name of the veteran pensioner. We have the date of the act in which the final payment would be made. We have the pension agency through which that final payment was made. We have a date of the final payment, and we have the death date of the pensioner. So if the date of death is there, then it's likely that the heirs are going to be shown. If it just stops and there's nothing after that, that's probably a last payment, and it's likely that we'll not be able to find the names of heirs. Although they may be named the wife may be named in a previous pension voucher, but it's not likely. So let's talk about pension vouchers for a moment. These are found in Record Group 217, the records of the accounting officers of the Treasury. Entry 721, there are 4,712 boxes. They're filed by state and then by agency, meaning Connecticut, meaning Albany, meaning Buffalo, that kind of thing. Also in these are Army and Navy pensions, are in the same records. Now, they will not give them to you by individual name. They will only give them to you by act, agency, year, and quarter. And this isn't a bad thing, because it allows you to go through the box yourself. And I always enjoy looking through a box rather than just getting the records that I'm looking for, because I never know what I'm going to find. I've even found my own ancestors in boxes that I was looking for somebody else in. So that's always, you never know what's going to happen. So I wouldn't advise you to go after the pension vouchers immediately. I would advise you to go after the last or final payments immediately because they're easier to get to. So a last payment is the last time that a pension office pays a pensioner. So the reasons that it could be a last time is the pensioner moves, the pensioner died and no one picked up a final payment. In other words, there wasn't enough to fool with it because he died close to his last payment. Or the pensioner just doesn't need the hassle anymore. It's not worth it for him to go as far as he has to go, whatever. There are lots of reasons for why there may be a last payment. Final payments, however, are payments made to heirs from the date of last payment to the date of death. And this could occur decades after the death of the pensioner. And until the 1860s, if the widow had died or the wife had died before the soldier, the heirs are all the children. So all the children have to come in to get the payment, which they split. So this is a good place to find heirs, and especially if it's long after the death of the pensioner. So these last and final payments are located in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. They are in entry 722, selected final payment vouchers, also in record group 217. And we order these by name, unlike the pension vouchers, pension agency, and your act. So this is Daniel Waldo's index card. This index card can be found on fold 3. The asterisk means that in the 1960s, when the archives went through to cull out these last and final payments, they were successful in finding the payment. So Daniel Waldo has a payment among these selected last and final payments. And what we learn here is that we knew he was in Albany. We knew it was the Act of 1832. Here's a payment made in the fourth quarter of 1864, and here he is dying in 1864. So this payment is being made after he dies, so therefore it's a final payment. You'll get a jacket that looks like this. And in that jacket, you may find interesting stuff. Here's a bill where his pension is being increased, and this occurred as a sort of a gift after him being the chaplain of the house. Here is an application for transfer. This is what takes him back into the pension agency. This shows that he belongs there. Here is a letter that talks about his death, and this is his children trying to get his final payment. So the children are identified in this letter as to who is what. Let's talk about somebody else that's a little clearer. Hedgeman Triplett is a Virginian. He's born in Culpeper. He's living in Franklin County, Kentucky in 1818. He applies under the Act of 1818. He does get a pension. He dies in 1837. His pension refers to 8 children. But unfortunately, in his pension application file, only one is named, and that's Polly Clements, who survived her father. The name of the wife, her death, or his marriage to her are not stated in the pension. That pretty much means that since Polly's being identified, that his wife predeceased her by quite a bit. Also in his pension is this piece of paper that I've talked about previously, the Act of 6 April 1838. So this will lead us to additional records. So when we go out to fold 3 and we look at the index to final pension payments, we see 2 things. This isn't normal. And the reason that we see 2 for Hedgeman is, and I'll show it to you in a second, one of the ledgers that he's in, there's a big ink blot, and the HED in the Hedgeman part is pretty much inked out, so nobody knows what his first name is. But they do see him in another one. So here we have Hedgeman Triplett. They do find his second quarter last payment, but they don't find his final payment. Notice the lack of an asterisk on the upper left-hand corner. So we have one payment that is found in the last and finals, and one payment that is not found in the last and finals. And the payment that's not found is the one that occurs after his death. So we definitely want to track that one down. Well, if you don't have the asterisk, the first place to look is the lost pensions settled accounts of 6 April 1838. Probably 2/3 of those that don't have asterisks are going to be found here. Sometimes on those index cards, you will see the words 6 April or April 1838 or 6 April 1838, and then you'll know that this is the finding aid that you have to go and look at. Now, there are two versions of this. There's the revised version, and then there was a version done in 1997. It doesn't matter which one you use, except that if you use the previous one, the first edition, you're going to have to use a crosswalk because it's based on box numbers, and those box numbers don't exist anymore. So what we're looking for now, in the revised edition, it's by year and by account number. So what we see is that the children are the ones who are coming in and making and requesting the payments. And in fact, there are 8 different payments for those children coming in. You'll find that these are, the widow could be coming in, the children could be coming in, an administrator could be coming in, a lawyer could be coming in. So what you need to know is the year and the account number. If you have the old box number, that can be converted into a year, so by the archive staff. So when we look in the settled account, we see that he died in 1837, which we knew, at his residence in Franklin County, Kentucky. He left no widow, but he had the following heirs. So it's naming each one of his children, those in Franklin County, Kentucky, who his children married. Nancy Poe married Edmund Poe. Elizabeth Grant, is the wife of Thomas Grant. Then we see some who aren't in Franklin County. We see Polly Clements. We see Lucy Palmer, the children of Lucy Palmer, at least Lucy Palmer, predeceased Hedgeman. So we have identified all of Hedgeman's grandchildren who are surnamed Palmer and where they live. And one of them lives in Louisiana, far removed from Franklin County, Kentucky. So this way, remember that in Hedgeman triplets pension, only one child was identified, Polly Clements. And now we have all of the children of Hedgeman triplet identified, and the children of Lucy Palmer, the daughter who predeceased him. So this is, in my world, this is really good stuff. Now there are, some of the final payments are on fold 3. The Delaware final payments are there. There is a finding aid to them. The Georgia final payments are also there. Each one is done a little differently, but both the Delaware and Georgia final payments are there. So those that are not from Georgia or Delaware, you're going to have to go to the National Archives to get. So what we've talked about today is pension law. We talked about pension application files. We've talked about pension ledgers. We've talked about pension vouchers, last payments, final payments, other settled accounts such as the Act of 6 April 1838. Another thing that you can do is when you go to statutes at large, not only look at the law, but plug your Revolutionary War soldier into statutes at large, just to see what Revolutionary War claims may be out there. There are not too many of these, but in Ancestry, there's an index to the correspondence of the Record and Pension Office. You want to check to see if your Revolutionary War soldier has something in that index. Most of what's in that index is Civil War, but occasionally there is Revolutionary War material there.
Thank you for the deep dive into pensions and the great information found there. Final payments became a very important thing to me in your presentation. I think it'd be very important to our ladies who try to prove the child of the patriot. So now let's look at some of the bounty land things that we wanted to know about. I know you are very well versed on it, and we'll see if we ask anything that you have trouble answering. So the question number 1. Are all of the bounty land records available online for the 9 states that issued bounty land?
Absolutely not. because bounty land research is in pieces. So there are pieces in the National Archives, there are pieces in the Bureau of Land Management.
Yes.
Once you establish that they in fact had bounty land, which you can do through their pension, because the pension for a Revolutionary War soldier will identify the bounty land, and it recognized that there are early bounty land acts, and then there's the Act of 1850, which did not give bounty land to Revolutionary War soldiers. And the Revolutionary War soldiers who were still living were very upset by the fact that those who had served their country and created their country weren't entitled to bounty land, but those War of 1812 soldiers who didn't do much at all were getting bounty land. So under the Old Man's Act of 1855, you see a lot of Revolutionary War soldiers and their heirs getting bounty land. And the reason is that that act equalized bounty land for everybody. So everybody was entitled to at least 160 acres. So the thing to do is to go out and look at the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management website, and look for the patents there and do a search on the individual's name there. But recognize that because a lot of the tracts that were set aside for Revolutionary War bounty land, which is what we're talking about in the 9 states,
Right.
they ran out of land. So what you had beginning in the 1820s, there's something called script acts. And for Virginia, you had the Script Act of 1852. Margie Brown's book on genealogical abstracts is a good place to start there. You want to see, because then the Script Acts allowed them to get land anywhere in the federal domain, not just those bounty land states.
And there again, errors may show up in some of those records. All right, question number 2. What was the process for a soldier to claim his bounty land warrant?
Well, he went into court and he proved that he had service, and then he submitted it to the government to a land office, and then the land office issued a survey, and it ended up with the land. And then the best thing that you can do to understand all this process and the nuance of it is that Christine Rose wrote a book on military bounty land. And if you give me a second, I'll go get it so I can show it on the screen. So this book, Military Bounty Land by Christine Rose, is by far the biggest and best deep dive into understanding bounty land. So if we're unable to cover it in the questions tonight, this is the best place to go to find the information about what the process is and how they went about it. The problem is most Revolutionary War soldiers assigned their bounty land to somebody else, either to a speculator. So there actually were very few soldiers who went out. Now, Virginia is sort of an exception because of the Virginia Military District. But there wasn't enough bounty land in the Ohio Military District for everybody else to fill it up. So, I mean, they pretty much everybody recognized they were too old to move.
Right. All right, question number 3. If there is an entry date and a survey date on the deed, what date must the claim be entered to be used to prove Revolutionary War service? Do all states have the same date?
Well, first of all, we're not talking about a deed. We're talking about a patent. Okay, because a deed, a grant, a patent is when the government transfers the land to a person, and then when that person sells the land, then there is a first deed. So if you've got a deed, then you haven't gotten to the original document of the land transaction. What you basically have, if someone is buying the land by deed, that's not a military grant. That's not a military warrant. That's somebody buying land. What the person who gets the grant or gets the bounty land, when he sells it, that's when the first deed is created. So it doesn't matter. To prove, none of those things are necessary to prove Revolutionary War service. Getting the patent is what proves the service. The the bounty land is after the fact. Now, there is an exception, and that exception is Georgia, because in Georgia, you don't have the entry dates, you don't have anything except the initials RW after the person's name in the uh, surveys. So, or the grants, and there's no paperwork to back that up, but we recognize that if it says RW, they do have Revolutionary War service. We just don't happen to know what it is.
Okay. All right. Question number 4. Was the land taken from refugees of Long Island by the British given back to them after the war? And how did they reclaim title to the land? If so, what happened to their land in Long Island? Or did they even own that?
That's, the answer to that question varies as a function of who it is coming back and trying to get the land. What, not so much in Long Island, but in Connecticut, we see because of the depredations, people end up in the Western Reserve.
Right.
This is not bounty land. The best thing to do is there's a 2-volume set on the refugees from Long Island that talks about them leaving Long Island and going to Connecticut. And then you can look at the individual families and see what actually happened to the individual families, because each situation could be different.
Well, that's great help, though, because each person has a different thing that they're researching.
Right. So it's called Refugees of 1776.
Okay. All right. Question number 5. How did the rules for applying for a pension differ from those applying for bounty land? Could a soldier apply for both?
Well, by 1855, the answer is yes, because everybody was entitled to 160 acres of land. So if you see a soldier only has 40 acres or 120 acres or something like that, then you want to look in 1855 to see if they have the equalizing amount to bring them up to 160. So it doesn't matter whether they apply for a pension or apply for bounty land. Now, there are times where you could get bounty land in lieu of a pension, or you could get a pension in lieu of bounty land. It depends on what law is in effect at the time. But most of that relates to the War of 1812, not to the Revolution.
Okay, very good. All right, question number 6. If a soldier was in the Continental Army, what kind of information exists to determine his state and county of residence?
Most of the, or early on in the war, most of the companies were raised at the company at the county level. So the company commander would be from usually would be a county lieutenant or someone, a high up member in the county somehow. And then the people would come and they would join his company in that county. So, for example, in Virginia, there's a book on Virginia military organizations by Sanchez Cervera that talks about each Continental Line regiment and each original company captain and what county they were from. So that's probably a good place to start, is in any book created at the state level that talks about company captains. Because it's not the regiment being raised in a county, it's a company being raised in a county, and then those companies, 10 of them generally, coming together to create a regiment.
And then you said they might live in a different state even when they apply for their pension.
When they apply for their pension, they may live in a different state.
Right.
But generally in the pension, it will say, the pension will tell you what state they serve from. The pension will tell you what the name of the captain is, and what you need to do is to find out. It's easier to find out what county the captain is from, because there are appointments and those kind of things, than it is to find out where the soldier's from.
Okay, very good. Question number 7. Was the granting of a pension connected in any way to the soldier's financial situation? I think you went over that in your presentation.
In the Act of 1818, we ignore it, although it's there. In the Act of 1820, we pay attention to their condition.
Mm.
Um, by 1828, all of that is removed, largely because congressmen like their jobs.
All right, question number 8. How common was it for someone to be paid for military service in a different county from residence? What distance is reasonable?
Okay, so it depends on what kind of military service we're talking about. If we're talking about continental, counties don't enter into it. So it doesn't have anything to do with it. It's a state regiment. If we're talking about militia, then you're not paid if you're serving from your own county and protecting your own county. But if you
Right.
go to a different county, the state generally pays if you're there more than 30 days. If you leave the state, the Continental Congress pays. So it 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 is not common for someone to be paid for military service in a different county from his residence, except that that may not be his residence. You just think it is because he's there.
Right.
So it may be that the other county is in fact um, his residence, and he's actually there for some in the other county serving because the militia unit has been ordered there, and he liked it so much he stayed.
Stayed there. Right. All right, question number 9. How do you differentiate militia from Continental Army and payrolls? If by officer, how do you find the officer and his unit?
Well, the payroll itself will tell you whether it's a line
Right.
regiment or whether it's a
Right.
militia regiment. The best thing you do for an officer is, I'll give Virginia as an example. Um, for all Continental Line officers, you would want to go to Heitman's on Ancestry or Google Books, or it's a book available from Genealogical Publishing Company on Heitman's Register of Continental Line Continental officers, and that gives you a vignette about each officer in the war.
Okay.
But it gives you a state, but it doesn't tell you county, but it does
Okay.
give you state. Um, but it will tell you what units he's in and what dates he's in that unit, and it will tell you when he's promoted.
Okay. Very good.
So,
All right, question number 10. How accurate do you think the 1840 census, federal census, was at enumerating Revolutionary War veterans?
I have probably found about 80% of the people I thought were living in 1840 who were Revolutionary War soldiers in the census.
Okay.
Um, but it's kind of hard to evaluate what, I mean, there are ones I just can't find, and they're not
Right.
there, and I had the expectation that they should be there, but they're not. Um, and it could very well be because they didn't identify themselves as such,
Right.
or their
Right.
family didn't identify them, or whatever. But I don't think
Right.
anybody knows how accurate it was. I just know not every. I know it's incomplete. That's the best I can say.
But there is, we do have some record there, so that
Yeah.
comes in
So
well.
they are there, um,
Right.
but nobody knows how accurate it actually is.
Sure. All right, question number 11. What is the best way to learn if a public claim was filed by my patriot or wife or family to be reimbursed for supplying the militia?
Well, without the best way, first of all, is you have to know what the state is.
Okay.
So, for example, in Virginia, there is the county level set and the 3-volume set counting the index of public claims by uh, Abercrombie and Slatton. North Carolina has published those. Hank Peden did one on Maryland public service. So you have to know what state it is, and the best way is to locate what publications have been done at the state level for public service claims. The other thing is to check the database at dar.org to see if in the soldiers uh, vignette in the ancestor database it says public service, and then track down what the public service
Right.
is by looking on the application.
Right.
Um, The other, I know uh, one of the things I was able to do was to track the convention prisoners through Virginia from Nolan's Ferry, where they were charged, where John Nolan attempted to charge 5 pence for every Hessian soldier that crossed his ferry. He didn't succeed, but he tried. And then I can track them through the farmlands because every farmer whose fences were cut down and whose corn was stolen by those Hessian prisoners as they moved south to the Albemarle barracks, and you can see them night by night, day by day, getting from Nolan's Ferry in Loudoun County to Charlottesville. So it's kind of funny. So you can track them through the public claims.
That's a wonderful reference. All right, question number 12. I know that after the Revolutionary War, women were not typically land or property owners. Is it worth it to search for females in the land records?
Oh, absolutely, because it may be that's the only way that you learn the maiden name of the female because she got the land
Right.
from her father.
Her
I
father.
mean, you
Yeah.
always want to track everybody through land. Helen Leary tells us that all the answers in genealogy, I'm probably paraphrasing, can be found in land records. You can't do genealogy without land records. You
I
just
know,
can't.
and that's the last thing we use sometimes because it seems
Right.
like a little bit more difficult. All right.
Always want to get them on the land. And I want to add to that, the most important thing that you can do once you're in the land records is to create an in and out table so that you know that you have all the land. So
Oh,
you want to create a table of all the land that has been purchased, and you want to create a table of all the land that is sold, and you want to see how it balances out and see what's missing.
and, and what's missing may be the most important
Exactly.
thing.
Exactly.
All right. Question 13 and the last question. I've heard that equity court records can be a valuable resource for names and family information. What is equity court and how do I access those records?
Well, equity court is another way of saying civil court. In other words, it's not criminal. So
Right.
what we see is like, say my father died, and he had a will, and the executor of the will didn't do their job, and I didn't get the money that was due me. Not that I have any expectation of money due me when my father dies, but so I would take the executor to court, and I would not go by myself, but I would go with my siblings, because if I was being treated that way, my siblings were probably being treated that way. So the whole family would go into court, and it wouldn't be
Right.
criminal, it would be civil. So how do you access these records? Well, in Virginia, the Library of Virginia has them up on their website.
Mm.
Um, so for example, by county. So I always search Virginians in the equity court records that are on the Library of Virginia website. But basically, you have to determine in the individual state that you are in how those records exist in the state archives. Do they exist online? Do they exist only in the state archives? And basically, the decision you have to make is based on the state where the records are.
Okay. Well, Craig, it's been a real pleasure to have you as part of our series. You have brought us such great information. On behalf of NSDAR, I truly thank you and hope maybe we'll
My
see
pleasure.
you again. All right.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you.
Our next presentation will be May 16, and our presenter will be David A. Lambert, Chief Genealogist for the New England Historic Genealogical Society. David will bring us 17th century New England resources. I certainly look forward to his lecture and tell us about the wealth of records he represents. Until we meet again, I leave you with this thought. Genealogy. It becomes an interest, it evolves into a hobby, and then it becomes an obsession. Good day.